My two kids, Sam and Robbie, are twins. They're 6 years old. A year ago, we were living at our old house, but something happened that forced us to move. It's a long and awful story, but I need to tell it because it still haunts me. I had lived in that house for 4 years. Carol, my wife, and I got married there, and we had our kids there. The neighborhood was slowly changing, and not for the better, but even still, we had originally planned on staying in that house for the foreseeable future. That is until everything changed. Our house was a corner lot, with a neighbor behind us on the intersecting road. Their property was shielded by a bunch of tall trees and bushes, so we hardly ever saw them. The neighbor on the right, though, was a different story. His name was Steve, and he had moved in less than a year before we did. I had only spoken to him a couple of times, but both times I could hardly understand what he was saying because of his heavy accent. He didn't seem like the friendliest guy either. 2 of his windows overlooked our backyard, and I had always assumed they were just guest rooms or something of the sort, because I never saw the lights on in either of them. Still, there wasn't much privacy from those windows. One summer afternoon, Sam and Robbie were outside playing in their blow-up pool, spraying each other with water guns. I was out doing some yard work. At one point, I was walking toward the detached garage when I saw Steve for a split second, standing at one of those windows. As soon as I noticed him, he turned and quickly walked away. It was odd, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the kids went back outside to play. They were enjoying their pool again, and Carol and I were in the kitchen where she was making dinner. The kids' laughter suddenly went quiet, and Robbie came running inside, his eyes wide with concern. He said there was a flashing light coming from Steve's window. I followed him back outside, and sure enough, I saw what he meant. He pointed to one of Steve's upstairs windows, and I noticed a white light flashing from it every few seconds. It immediately crossed my mind that it looked like a camera flash. I asked the kids if it looked like that to them, and they both said yes. I told them it was time to come inside and dry off. Afterward, I told Carol about what Robbie had said. She immediately grew worried, just like I did, and suggested that I go next door and ask Steve about it. But Steve wasn't home. His car was in the driveway, but after knocking several times and ringing the bell, no one answered. I went back inside, frustrated and unsettled, and told Carol that Steve had ignored me. The kid's story now seemed more believable. We couldn't prove the flashes were from a camera, but it sure looked like it. The days went on, but the feeling of unease lingered. Then, a few weeks later, Carol and I were in bed one night when we heard the side gate to the yard being opened and closed. It was quiet, but enough to stir us both from our sleep. Carol asked me to go check, so I reluctantly got out of bed, throwing on some clothes and heading into the backyard. I searched around with the lights on, but found nothing. But then I noticed the lights were on in Steve's backyard. I walked over to the fence to look over, and almost jumped out of my skin when Steve suddenly appeared at the fence, asking if I needed something. I asked him if he'd seen anyone sneaking through our yard, and he said no. I also bluntly asked him if he had been watching my kids, since Robbie mentioned seeing flashes coming from his window when they were playing in the pool. His reaction was bizarre. He became overly offended, almost yelling at me for the accusation. I felt the tension rising, but with no proof, I apologized and left. Carol was livid when I told her what had happened. She was convinced that Steve was hiding something. But things didn't end there. Another few weeks passed, and one night we were all asleep when I woke to Carol shaking me in a panic. At first I was confused, but then I heard it. Our kids screaming from their room. I rushed downstairs to find Robbie in tears. Both kids were upset. Robbie said someone had been outside their window, and he saw a flash of light. My heart sank and my blood ran cold. I asked him what the person looked like, but Robbie couldn't give me a description. In a daze, I took them into our room to sleep with us. But before I could calm down, I peeked out the bedroom window to check Steve's house. Through the darkened window, I saw him. Steve, standing in the same window that overlooked our backyard, peeking out at us. My stomach twisted with dread. I stormed outside and rang his doorbell at least 15 times, but he never answered. I called the police to file a report, just in case. I wasn't sure what I could do, but I wanted something on record. We never saw Steve again. He started avoiding being outside when I was out front, always staying inside. It became impossible for us to feel safe there. We couldn't shake the feeling that Steve had been watching us for months. Within a month, we moved to a new house in a different town. It's been a much better place to raise the kids, but the memories of our old house linger. I'll never forget the way I felt in that house, always looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched even in my own backyard. It's been a year, but I can't forget the unease I felt living next door to Steve. The smiling neighbor, the friendly stranger. Sometimes the people we trust are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Now, when we sit outside at our new home, I never let my guard down. I've learned that even the safest places can become the most terrifying. I've always valued solitude, especially when I was teaching yoga. My backyard had been my sanctuary, my retreat, where I could unwind, practice, and be at peace. Over the years, I meticulously set it up with potted plants, fairy lights, and even a small koi pond in the far corner. By March 2023, it was perfect. Every morning and evening, I'd roll out my mat, surrounded by the fragrance of flowers and the whispers of the wind. It felt like my little corner of the world, safe and untouched by anything or anyone. But that peace shattered in a single afternoon. It was a Wednesday, with the weather that makes you feel like spring has arrived early. Clear skies, warm sun, and a gentle breeze. I just finished with a private client, and the rest of my day was free. Deciding to make the most of it, I tidied the shed in the back corner of my yard. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place for tools and gardening supplies. But every spring, I made it a point to clear it out, organize it, and get rid of what I no longer needed. I put on some music and set to work, clearing rusted trowels, rearranging flower pots, and making sure everything was in its proper place. About an hour into the task, I decided to move a heavy box of tools that had been sitting on the bottom shelf for years. As I shifted it, something slipped out from behind and fell to the floor with a soft thud. At first, I thought it was just an old battery pack or some forgotten gadget, but when I picked it up, my stomach dropped. It was a small black camera, sleek and modern, something you might see in spy movies. My first thought was that it must have been something my ex-boyfriend had left behind. He was always into tech and gadgets, but then I noticed the tiny blinking light. The camera was still on. A cold shiver ran through me as I stared at it. I hadn't been back here in weeks. Who would leave a camera running in my shed? I flipped open the small panel on the back. There, nestled inside, was a memory card. My curiosity got the better of me, and I rushed back to the house, eager and nervous, sliding the card into my laptop. When the folder opened, I wasn't ready for what I saw. The footage was grainy but clear. It was me, on my yoga mat, moving through my morning poses in the center of my backyard. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I clicked through the files, my heart pounding. There were dozens of videos, each one showing different times of day and different outfits. Some from early mornings when the sun barely kissed the earth, others from sunset when the yard would glow orange and pink. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One video showed me sitting on the back porch, tea in hand, chatting on the phone. It was from last week. Someone had been watching me, not just while I practiced yoga, but during the quiet moments when I thought I was alone, enjoying a cup of tea. The sense of violation was overwhelming. I slammed the laptop shut and stared at the screen, hands shaking. I stood up, pacing around the room, replaying every moment I'd spent in my backyard over the last few weeks. It had always felt like a haven, my little world, hidden from prying eyes by tall fences and thick hedges. Now that illusion was shattered. Someone had been watching me without my knowledge. I couldn't stay still for long. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried back to the shed, determined to search it thoroughly. My hands trembled as I pulled boxes off shelves, checked behind tools, and scanned every corner. But nothing. As I turned to leave, I noticed something. The fence, one section of the wooden slats, was slightly askew. It looked like someone had pried it open and tried to fix it quickly. I crouched down and shone the flashlight along the gap. Faint scuff marks in the dirt, someone had climbed through. I felt a wave of nausea, but my body was also buzzing with adrenaline. My backyard wasn't as private as I thought. Back inside, I was in a daze. My thoughts were scattered, and I didn't know what to do. Call the police, but how would I explain this? Someone hid a camera in my shed, but I don't know who or when. Instead, I locked all the doors and windows, pulled the curtains tight, and slept with a heavy wrench by my side. The next morning, I packed up the camera and the memory card, placed them in a Ziploc bag, and drove straight to the police station. The officer at the desk listened patiently as I explained the situation, and while I felt ridiculous, the moment I showed her the footage, her expression changed. She took the information and promised to look into it. What followed were the longest days of my life. Every time I heard a noise outside, I jumped. I kept peeking through the blinds, double-checking the locks. My sanctuary now felt like a stage, with me unknowingly performing for an audience I couldn't see. I even stopped practicing yoga. My backyard no longer felt like a safe retreat. Days later, the police called. I could barely breathe as the officer explained that they'd traced the camera back to my next-door neighbor. He'd been sneaking into my yard at night and setting it up, recording me without my knowledge. They'd found additional footage on his computer. My hands shook as I tried to process it all. He was being charged with stalking, trespassing, and invasion of privacy. I don't remember much of what I said after that. I just remember sitting on the couch, staring at the wall in stunned silence. The man I'd waved to so many times, who I'd exchanged pleasantries with over the fence, had been watching me. The police confiscated his equipment, and within a week, he'd moved out. But my peace was gone. Every time I stepped into the yard, I felt exposed. I installed security cameras, replaced the old wooden fence with a taller reinforced one, and even got a big loud dog. For months, I couldn't fully relax. Even when friends came over and we laughed on the porch, I would find myself glancing toward the fence, that gnawing feeling creeping up on me that someone was still watching. It's been almost a year now. My backyard feels a little more like home again, but it will never feel the same. I still practice yoga, but only indoors, where I can lock the doors and close the blinds. I've come to realize that you can never truly know the people around you. The friendly neighbor, the smiling stranger. Sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And sometimes the safest places can turn into the most dangerous. I've always been the guy who values a good relationship with his neighbors. Lending out a ladder here, picking up mail while someone's out of town there. It's the glue that turns a neighborhood into a community. When my neighbor to the left moved out and their house sat empty for months, it felt like a missing piece in the rhythm of daily life. So, when a guy named Todd moved in one sunny day in early May of 2021, I was excited to introduce myself. Todd looked about my age, mid-30s, maybe a little younger. He was friendly, the kind of guy who was just the right mix of chatty and polite. We shook hands, and he mentioned he was looking for a fresh start in Raleigh after moving from New York. He said he was between jobs, but didn't elaborate much, and I didn't push. People move for all sorts of reasons. I offered to help him with a few boxes, but he politely declined, saying he had everything under control. Over the next few weeks, Todd seemed like a decent guy. He'd wave when I pulled into the driveway, compliment my gardening, and even ask how my day was going. One Saturday morning, he wandered over as I was cleaning out my garage. "Wow, man," he said, eyeing my neatly organized shelves. "You've got all the tools anyone could ever need." I laughed. Hazard of being a homeowner. You never know what project's coming next. He nodded, then asked if he could borrow a power drill to hang some shelves. It wasn't a big deal. I'd loaned tools to plenty of neighbors before. A couple of days later, he returned it with a smile and a thank you. Looking back, it was so casual, so ordinary. Nothing about it raised any red flags. But about a month later, little things started to nag at me. First, a wrench I swore I'd put back wasn't in my toolbox when I needed it. Then, a pair of work gloves disappeared from my workbench. I brushed it off, figured I'd misplaced them. My garage wasn't exactly spotless after all. One night, though, I went out to grab a stepladder from the shed and noticed the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd latched it earlier, but nothing seemed out of place. Probably the wind, I told myself, though something about it didn't sit right. Then Todd's behavior started to change. He was still friendly, but he began showing up more often, lingering during conversations. Once, he asked what time I usually left for work. "Just curious," he said with a grin. "Wanted to know if you'd need help with that fence you're fixing up." I'm around most mornings. That struck me as odd. Who keeps track of their neighbor's schedule like that? One evening, I decided to take inventory of my garage. Call it paranoia, but I wanted to double-check that everything was where it belonged. As I went through my shelves, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Some tools were missing. My ratchet set was gone, as was a flashlight I kept on a hook. The more I thought about it, the more suspicious Todd seemed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I got up to grab a glass of water. My kitchen window overlooks the backyard, and as I stood there, I noticed movement near the edge of my property. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a stray dog. But then I saw a figure moving toward Todd's house, carrying something large and heavy. It was Todd. I stood frozen, watching him disappear into the shadows. Why was he sneaking around in the middle of the night? And what was he carrying? The next morning, I decided to confront him. I waited until I saw him sitting on his porch with a coffee mug, pretending everything was normal. I walked over casually, keeping my tone light. "Hey Todd, weird question for you," I began. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about some tools going missing, would you? I've noticed a few things out of place in my garage." Todd's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "Nah man, haven't seen anything. I've got enough on my plate with unpacking." Something about his tone felt off, too casual, too rehearsed. "You sure?" I pressed. "I saw you out pretty late last night. Looked like you were carrying something heavy." His expression tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shot back, his tone defensive. Then he forced a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're mistaken. I was home all night. That evening, I'd had enough. I called the landlord of the property next door, explaining my concerns about my new neighbor. What he told me made my stomach drop." "Neighbor? I haven't rented that house out yet." "What do you mean?" I stammered. "Someone's living there right now." He introduced himself as Todd. There was a long pause. "Sir, no one is supposed to be in that house. I'll come by tomorrow with the police." That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump. By morning, the landlord and police arrived. When they knocked on the door, there was no answer. The officers broke the lock and stepped inside. The house was nearly empty, except for a pile of stolen items in the basement. My tools, along with other neighbors' belongings. A bike, power tools, and even a box of jewelry. Todd, or whoever he was, had vanished. The police said he'd likely been squatting there for months, using the house as a base to steal from the neighborhood. I spent the next week installing locks and security cameras, vowing never to trust so easily again. Todd had seemed harmless, helpful even, a guy you'd share a beer with. But it was all an act, and the scariest part was just how convincing he'd been.